"You're not family anymore," my brother said as he locked the front door behind me. I stood on the porch with 2 worn suitcases, my mother's Bible pressed against my chest, and nowhere in the world to go. He looked at me like I was a stranger. I looked at the house, where I'd spent 43 years of my life, and realized grief wasn't the worst thing waiting for me that day. My name is Linda, and this happened in a little town outside Knoxville, Tennessee, where folks still waved from pickup trucks and everybody knew, whose porch light burned after midnight. That white farmhouse at the end of our gravel road had belonged to my parents for over 4 decades. After Daddy passed, I stayed because Mama couldn't manage alone. 1 year became 5. 5 became 12. I cooked every meal, paid every bill, drove her to every doctor's appointment, and sat beside her through long summer evenings while cicadas sang beyond. The fence in the porch swing creaked beneath our feet. My younger brother, Carl, and my sister Denise visited just enough to keep up appearances. They brought flowers on holidays, smiled for family photographs, and hurried home before the dishes were washed. I never complained. Mama always said peace was worth more than winning an argument. The morning we buried her felt strangely still. The church parking lot was filled with dusty trucks. Sweet tea sweated in plastic cups beside trays of fried chicken and casseroles. Neighbors hugged me, thanking me for caring for Mama when nobody else could. Carl accepted every compliment with a polite smile, but I caught him glancing toward the house more than once. It just didn't sit right. By late afternoon, the last car pulled away. Carl cleared his throat. "Let's settle the family business." Inside the kitchen, Denise quietly shut the screen door. Carl placed a thick manila folder on Mama's old oak table. "The house is ours now," he said evenly. "You'll need to be out by Monday." I didn't argue. I opened the folder instead. Most of the papers looked ordinary. Then I reached the final page. The signature said Margaret Lawson. I stared at it for several long seconds, because one small detail told me my mother had never written her name that way. I kept my face calm and folded the papers as carefully as if they were made of glass. Carl watched me with the kind of smile that expected a fight, while Denise leaned against the counter with her arms crossed, waiting for tears that never came. "Well?" Carl asked. I looked him in the eye and simply said, "I'll be out by Monday." The surprise on his face lasted only a second. He had prepared himself for shouting, not silence. Early Monday morning, I packed everything that truly belonged to me into my old blue sedan. 2 suitcases, Mama's Bible, a box of family photographs, Daddy's worn coffee mug, and a quilt Mama had sewn years before. I paused on the front porch as the cool, Tennessee breeze stirred the wind chimes she loved so much. The smell of fresh-cut grass drifted across the yard, and for a moment, I could almost hear her telling me that hard seasons never lasted forever. I closed the screen door without another word and drove away. By that evening, I was renting a small room above the detached garage of Mrs. Eleanor Harper, a widow from church who never asked questions she knew I wasn't ready to answer. The room was simple, with faded wallpaper, an old coffee maker humming on the counter, and rain tapping softly against the tin roof after dark. But for the first time in days, I slept without hearing someone else's demands. 2 mornings later, I walked into Miller's Hardware downtown and asked if they needed help. Mr. Miller remembered that I'd once managed the books for our church fundraiser. "Can you still keep records?" he asked. "Every penny," I answered. He hired me that afternoon. The paycheck wasn't much, but it was honest, and every Friday I deposited a little into a new savings account. I also began organizing every receipt, every bank statement, every legal document Carl had handed me. I wasn't building a case yet. I was building a habit of keeping the truth close. Folks around town quietly wondered why I no longer lived in my parents' home, but I never criticized my brother or sister. I simply smiled and said, "Sometimes the truth walks slower than a lie." Then, late one rainy Thursday afternoon, my phone rang. The man on the other end introduced himself as my mother's longtime attorney, and the first words out of his mouth made my heart stop. "Linda, I think your mother was trying to warn you." I drove to Mr. Walter Simmons' office the very next morning, following the same county road Mama and I had traveled dozens of times over the years. His office hadn't changed a bit. The waiting room still smelled of old paper, furniture polish, and fresh coffee. Family photographs hung beside framed law degrees, and the old grandfather clock in the corner ticked so loudly it seemed to measure every heartbeat. Mr. Simmons greeted me with a tired smile and invited me into his office before closing the door. He reached into a filing cabinet and placed a worn yellow envelope on his desk. "I found this while organizing retired client files," he said quietly. "Your mother left instructions that it wasn't to be opened until after her funeral." My hands trembled as I unfolded the letter inside. Mama's handwriting was as familiar to me as my own. She wrote that she had become worried after Carl repeatedly pressured her to sign papers she didn't understand. She admitted she had refused every time and asked Mr. Simmons to keep copies of her genuine signatures on file because, in her words, "If anyone ever claims I signed away this house, don't believe it until you compare my handwriting." I felt the air leave my lungs. Without saying another word, Mr. Simmons unlocked another cabinet and spread nearly 20 years of legal documents across his desk: tax forms, property records, wills, and notarized affidavits, each bearing Mama's verified signature. Then he carefully placed the deed Carl had shown me beside them. Even to my untrained eyes, something looked wrong. The letters were stiff. The graceful curve Mama always used on the final N in Lawson was missing. Mr. Simmons adjusted his glasses and studied the page for several quiet moments before looking at me. "Linda," he said, "I can't accuse anyone of forgery based on suspicion alone. But after 40 years practicing law, I've learned to trust what the evidence whispers before it starts shouting." He explained that the next step would require a certified handwriting examiner and copies of the county records. It wouldn't happen overnight, but it would happen the right way. As I stood to leave, his secretary knocked softly and opened the door. "Walter," she said, "there's a gentleman here asking about the Lawson family." Mr. Simmons frowned. "Who is it?" She glanced toward the waiting room before answering. "Your old neighbor, Harold Benson. He says he remembers the day Carl brought those papers to your mother's house, and he believes everyone has been told the wrong story." Harold Benson removed his cap as he stepped into Mr. Simmons's office, looking uneasy, like a man who had carried something too long. He had lived next door to my parents for nearly 30 years, and I trusted him as much as anyone outside my own family. He settled into the chair across from us and took a slow breath. "Linda," he said, "I've been praying about whether to tell you this. I reckon it's finally time." He explained that about 6 months before Mama died, he had been repairing our old mailbox when Carl pulled into the driveway carrying a stack of papers. Mama had invited Harold inside because she wanted him to adjust a loose porch railing afterward. As he entered the kitchen, he overheard Carl saying, "Just sign these, Mama. They're only for the insurance company." Harold remembered, Mama pushing the papers back across the table. "No, sir," she had replied. "Walter Simmons reads anything important before I put my name on it." Carl's smile disappeared. He gathered the papers quickly, muttered something under his breath, and left the house looking angry. Harold admitted he hadn't thought much about it until he heard I had been forced out of the family home. Mr. Simmons immediately requested a certified copy of the deed from the county recorder's office and hired a forensic handwriting examiner. 2 weeks later, the report arrived. The examiner concluded that the signature on the deed showed clear signs of simulation and did not match Margaret Lawson's verified handwriting. That report became the foundation of our legal case. Mr. Simmons filed a petition asking the court to void the fraudulent property transfer. Carl responded by insisting I was making false accusations because I wanted the house for myself. I never answered him publicly. I let the documents speak while he kept talking. Around town, people slowly began noticing the difference. Folks who had once believed Carl's version of events started asking quiet questions. Denise stopped defending him altogether. At Sunday service, she sat alone 3 pews behind her brother, staring at the hymnal instead of the choir. She didn't have to explain herself. Everyone could see something had changed. A month later, the county courthouse mailed both sides a hearing date. For the first time since Mama's funeral, Carl would have to stand before a judge, raise his right hand, swear to tell the truth, and explain how a signature Mama never wrote had somehow found its way onto the deed to our family home. The courtroom was almost silent except for the shuffle of papers and the low hum of the ceiling fan. There were no dramatic outbursts, no surprise confessions, and no speeches worthy of television. Real life rarely works that way. The judge spent hours reviewing every piece of evidence with careful attention. Mr. Simmons presented Mama's handwritten letter, decades of verified signatures, the forensic handwriting report, and Harold Benson's testimony describing the day. Mama refused to sign Carl's paperwork. Carl insisted the deed was genuine, but each answer he gave created another question he couldn't explain. When the judge asked why there were no independent witnesses to the alleged signing, Carl stumbled. When asked why the signature differed from every verified document his mother had signed over 20 years, he had no reasonable explanation. Facts have a quiet strength that arguments can never match. By the end of the hearing, the judge ruled that the recorded deed was invalid because the evidence clearly showed it had not been lawfully executed. Ownership of the house returned to my mother's estate, and the court ordered Carl to reimburse the legal expenses caused by the fraudulent filing. I felt no triumph, only relief. I had not walked into that courthouse hoping to defeat my brother. I had walked in hoping the truth would finally have its turn. A few months later, the house was sold through the proper legal process, and my share allowed me to buy a modest cottage just outside town. It wasn't large, but it had a wide front porch, a maple tree in the yard, and enough room for the family photographs Carl had once tried to take from me. One crisp autumn afternoon, nearly 18 months after he had locked me out, I saw Carl outside the grocery store. He looked older than I remembered. His shoulders were bent, and people who once stopped to chat with him simply nodded and kept walking. As I headed toward my car, several neighbors called my name, asking about church and inviting me to supper. Carl watched quietly from across the parking lot. For a brief moment, our eyes met, but neither of us spoke. We didn't need to. The truth had already said everything that mattered. As I drove home beneath the turning leaves, I realized Mama had been right all those years ago. Character isn't proven when life is easy. It's revealed when the people closest to you give you every reason to surrender, and you choose dignity instead.